This podcast episode was made possible in part with support from Sacred Rites, a project funded by the Henry Luce Foundation and the E. Rhodes and Leona B. Carpenter Foundation and hosted by Northeastern University. Sacred Rites is a project that supports public scholarship on religion and provides resources and networks for scholars of religion committed to translating the significance of their research to a broader audience. I recommend you learn more about Sacred Rites on their website at sacred-rites.org or find Sacred Rites on Twitter at sacred_rites. Welcome to Classical Ideas. This is Greg Soden. This is a podcast where, since 2017, I have discussed all things religion with a variety of fantastic scholars, historians, journalists, and educators. On this episode, I am delighted to welcome Dr. Patrick De Silva. Patrick De Silva completed his Ph.D. in Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and is a faculty member of the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Denver. His current research projects include analyzing the intersection of race, religion, and cultural appropriation in contemporary science fiction, as well as the history of how Jews, Christians, and Muslims have engaged with yoga. On this episode, we dive deep into his interest in religion and science fiction, discuss what religion and science fiction ask us to consider about the great questions in life, and then we narrow in on Frank Herbert's Dune novel and discuss what is enjoyable and worthy of critique from the novel and recent films. You can find Dr. Patrick De Silva online at patrickjdesilva.com. Thank you so much for listening. Please enjoy our conversation. Dr. Patrick De Silva, welcome to Classical Ideas.
Well, thank you, Greg. I'm thrilled to be here. Look forward to our conversation.
I'm delighted that you're here as well. I'm wondering if you can just start off by telling the audience a little bit about who you are and what you do.
I am presently teaching in the Religious Studies department at the University of Denver. I handle the Islamic Studies courses because that's my training. My Ph.D. is in Religious Studies with a focus on Islamic Studies. And then I also teach an advanced undergraduate seminar called Religion and Science Fiction, which is a big part of what I'm here to talk about with you. I live in Boulder, Colorado. I've lived here. This is like our second time living here. My wife is from this area, and yeah, we met in college, and then we moved here, and then I decided to go back to school. We moved to North Carolina for 5 years, 2013 to 2018. Then I finished the dissertation, and we decided to come back. So I've been teaching at a couple of different universities up and down the Front Range, and right now my path is at DU. We do this thing in Colorado where we have like the University of Colorado at Boulder, but everyone calls it CU Boulder. It's the University of Denver, but everyone calls it DU. So it's a good shibboleth to know if you're from the area. If you say you're at University of Denver, people look at you like, do you mean DU?
You just said a phrase that I've never heard before. Did you say Front Range?
That's right. Yes. So what we call the Front Range, so there's Denver metro area, but then the Front Range. So we're up against like the Rocky Mountains. But yeah, so that's a good sort of geographic identifier. So we're not in the mountains, but we're right up in Boulder, we're right up against the mountains.
So I also want to know about some of your other backstories as well. I was reading some of your work and I noticed that you have spent a lot of time in your life living in Sudan, Kenya, various states like Virginia, North Carolina as well, which you already mentioned. Tell me a little bit about your backstory of like growing up around the world, because that really caught my attention.
Let's see. When I was 1 year old, I moved with my parents. Well, they moved me. My parents moved me because that one, I didn't have a lot to say on the matter. We moved to Khartoum, Sudan, which is the capital city of Sudan. It's where the Blue and the White Nile actually come together. And my parents were teaching at different universities in Khartoum, and so we lived there for a few years. Then we went back to Virginia, which I should have started this where I was born, in Northern Virginia. Then when I was in, I then we moved back to Khartoum for me for first, second, and third grade.
Wow.
Uh, and then we went to Virginia. again for five, I think 5 years. And then we moved back to this time to East Africa to Nairobi, Kenya, which is where I did most of high school. At that point, my dad had switched over to working for the U.S. Agency for International Development. He's an agricultural economist by training, which is maybe one reason I didn't take any econ courses. It's because I felt like I had gotten it around the dining room table, growing up. So yeah, so for me, growing up, I have this very visceral memory of, especially living in Sudan, hearing Arabic a lot. It wasn't like, the Arabic language and sort of Islam in general was never strange or weird for me because it was such a huge part of my early childhood experience. And so
Hmm.
actually that's something that I've reflected on a lot as I've grown up, and it's thinking about what is weird to me is not weird to other people, and vice versa, and how much of my sort of normative standards of weirdness, for lack of a better phrase, are really a function of my life experiences. And so, I think there's a lot of to talk about there in terms of the connections between what I have ended up doing, which is going into this field of religious studies, and then, my lifelong love of science fiction, and more recently I've gotten more into fantasy, but
Mm.
initially it was all science fiction. And a big part of that, you mentioned reading some of my work. So I wrote this piece, kind of my own kind of origin stories, called Origin Stories on Faith and Science Fiction, published by Humanities North Dakota magazine. And I reflected on how throughout my life, I can use science fiction to better understand different passages in my life. So, for example, grew up watching Star Wars, like so many people. But for me, I realized just last year when I was writing this essay, one of the reasons that Star Wars grabbed me is that the original film, so Episode 4, we can get into George Lucas's sort of sequencing or math skills later. But episode 4 it opens on the desert world of Tatooine. And when my parents' friends gave me a VHS copy of the original Star Wars film, that was certainly a copy of a copy of a copy. There was a lot of static on it. I would watch it every day. Well, when I looked outside my window, we were living in Sudan. Khartoum is sort of on the edge of the Sahara Desert. Sahara is just the Arabic word for desert. So saying Sahara Desert to me is like ATM machine. The landscape really grabbed me from that Star Wars film because it was familiar. And if I had been growing up at the time, like in a different environment, like Northern Virginia is closer to Dagobah, the sort of swampy jungle world where Luke goes in episode 5 for Empire Strikes Back, where he meets Yoda. And so that's something else I've been reflecting on, is this connection between the environment, like the physical landscape, and then kind of culturally, religiously, what's the landscape like? And just appreciating how my experiences, are really different than a lot of people that even now that I sort of live and work with.
Mm. Is that your earliest memory of how you became interested in science fiction, is like this VHS tape and then looking out your window and kind of seeing some like connection to what you were seeing on TV versus in your actual day-to-day life? Is that kind of where you made this earliest connection?
I think so. I mean, to be fair, I do have an earlier memory of my parents taking me to their friend's house, different friend, and we watched the Michael Jackson Thriller video,
Mm-hmm.
which I found like terrifying as a young
Yeah.
child. So that was not something that I was like watching and rewatching. But with Star Wars, I mean, I remember um, in early elementary school, I would like come home and I would watch a Star Wars film,
Yeah.
because by that time we had all of the original trilogy, and my aunt, who's also my godmother, had like sent them to us. And we didn't have like regular TV in Khartoum in the late 80s. So it was just, I just relied on these VHS tapes that she and other, sort of extended family would send to us. And it was like getting this sort of manna from heaven, you know. I was like, oh, what is there going to be like what it's going to be on these tapes? And so I spent, let's just say I spent a lot of time watching that original trilogy.
I love that. Well, I did read that on faith and science fiction article that you mentioned being published with Humanities North Dakota. I do want to talk a little bit about that because we're going to get into some stuff right now. Is a really big time for you as well, with some writing that you've been doing about the Dune franchise that's been released the last couple of years. But I want to talk a little bit about science fiction just in general. In your view, like what does science fiction ask of readers and challenge readers to do that maybe other forms of literature don't?
I think the biggest thing that comes to mind when I conjure up this sort of category of science fiction in my mind is, typically we focus on the technology side. Like we think science fiction, there's spaceships, there's different technology, tools and devices that the people have that are way more advanced, sophisticated than we have presently. But I think more sort of going deeper than that, what that sort of displacement from our current day, our current time period does for us when I'm reading something or when I'm watching something, or even sometimes I listen to audio dramas, is it gets me out of my immediate day-to-day life. And that displacement then allows me to, if it's well done science fiction, oftentimes there's a real serious kind of social critique that's embedded in the narrative. And so because like let's talk about race and racism, for example. This is a great example. If you have a Star Trek episode and they go to some, distant world and they encounter people who are, treating each other horribly based purely on what the, crew of the Star Trek of the Starship Enterprise see as an artificial construction. The idea for me is I take that and then that helps me come back into my own world, right? When the episode ends after, whatever, 42, 44 minutes. And I think more critically about how we do that to each other here on planet Earth in the early 21st century. And for me, that's one of the real powers of science fiction is that displacement factor. You take people who, if you were to talk to them about race, or we could talk about gender or sexuality, approach it from a disability lens as well, people who maybe would be resistant to talking about those categories critically in our own world because we have our sort of ego selves, our identities are invested in a particular understanding of those identity factors like, so race, gender, sexuality, class, and so forth. But then somehow when you're watching the movie or you're watching it on your phone or your TV screen, you're swept up in this narrative. And it oftentimes what I found in teaching this stuff is it doesn't take that much prodding for people to start to see behind that proverbial curtain and see that narratives that are in some of these science fiction franchises, like Avatar, both the James Cameron production and the more like what's currently on Netflix with the live action adaptation of Avatar, The Last Airbender. Right. In both of those series, there's incredible narratives that we can talk about in terms of colonization,
Hmm.
resisting colonization, what it means kind of in a broader sense, like staying true to yourself. What is your destiny? How much choice do any of us have in what we do? And that leads me to, this other thing that I sort of do for a living, which is teaching and writing about religion. And that is where I see this wonderful intersection between sci-fi and the academic study of religion is these core questions of, who are we? This is what I tell my students. So in the sci-fi and religion course, I say, okay, who are we? Where are we from? Where are we going? How do we define us versus them? Or, who is the other? Who is one of us? And when we encounter someone who we consider other, what do we do with them? Do
Mm,
we welcome them or do we eat them?
yeah.
And I think that's been very helpful for me in terms of studying both religious traditions and mythological traditions, and then of course looking at science fiction and fantasy.
Yeah, I love that overlapping interest that you mentioned and the questions that science fiction asks us, and also what the academic study of religion asks us. Like, that's really not all that different. And you can see why, so many religious things pop up in science fiction. Like, everybody can talk about how much religious philosophy inspired George Lucas with Star Wars. You know what I mean? That's come up over and over again for years now. And something else that happens in this piece that's really interesting is you talk about some critical moments in your own life where, like the wisdom found in science fiction may have had an impact on how you handled certain challenges, like in your early life, such as like an illness with your mother, a near-death experience you had hiking. Say a little bit more about that, because I was more curious about hearing those stories too.
Well, one of the things that came up for me as I was writing that essay is I reflected on how I have, even though I grew up in the Catholic Church going to Mass, in many ways, I don't know that those stories from whether it was the Hebrew Bible or the New Testament or subsequent, sort of Christian literature, I don't know that I identified with those characters in those stories in the same way that I identified with and sort of elevated to exemplars these characters from these science fiction franchises. So one of the things I say in the essay is that instead of WWJD, for me it was what would Obi-Wan Kenobi do,
Hmm.
right? And I've met a lot of people who look at these heroic figures from these franchises and they identify with them where they start to think about them in terms of, well, Captain Picard would do this in this situation, right? And you could think of all type of characters from these different stories. It's like, well, what would Harry Potter do, right? And that's one of the reasons I love that sort of aspect of Christian material culture in the 20th and 21st centuries, especially in the US, is that we've taken Jesus and we've turned him into this, it's on a wristband, it's on a t-shirt, it's on a necklace, it's on a hat, whatever. And it's marketed as a way to remind yourself, right? You have this little totem that then you carry with you to remind yourself of who your exemplar is. And simultaneously, because everyone can see the hat or the t-shirt that you're wearing, especially, you're signifying something about yourself to other people. And if they vibe with you on that score, then they are also reminded of it. Now maybe it turns them off because it's not their community, or maybe it pulls them in and they're like, what do those things mean? And so when I go to like our Denver fan, now it's called Denver Fan Expo. It used to be called Comic Con, I think, and then it
Hmm.
was like Pop Culture Con. But you get the drift, right? And
Yeah.
so when someone's walking around, cosplaying as a particular character from their favorite series, number one, it's just incredible to see the artistry in those costumes. A
Yes.
couple of years ago, I saw someone dressed as Ahsoka Tano, and it was such high level,
Yeah.
high level cosplay. And so actually now I wish I could go back and interview that person now that the Ahsoka, series has come out to get, to see, okay, so this person is very important to you, right? This character is very important to you. What is it about them that grabs you? What is it about them that speaks to you? And so for me, you mentioned these things that I brought up in the essay. So my mother being very ill, especially when I was in high school and then in college. When I was towards the end of high school, I had this hiking accident where I fell and I broke several vertebrae in my back, and I very easily could have died or had a sort of lifelong paralysis that very
Hmm.
easily could have happened. And so reflecting on that, how at that time, towards the end of high school, I was part of a more sort of evangelical Christian youth group, and, a lot of my friends who were in the youth group who were either evangelical themselves or had more kind of evangelical leanings, their parents were like, oh, God has this plan for you, that I had survived this accident that where I easily could have died. And I think I kept coming back to this question of maybe the plan could have involved not breaking my back.
Hmm.
Like maybe that plan, maybe we could adjust that plan and that would have been just fine.
Yeah.
Because there's adversity And then there's things that you're like, yeah, I don't know that I needed to go through that. And I'm not sure that it was this learning experience that maybe the people around me are making it out to be. Which then takes us to and a little bit of a leap to the classic sort of philosophical and religious studies question or theological question of theodicy, right? The problem of evil, the problem of suffering. If God is all powerful, if there's some type of deity that we call God that is all powerful and all loving, which is oftentimes a Christian claim, then why do things happen the way that they happen in the world? And there's no real convincing answer for that, as I see it, without bringing in some type of faith claim. There's no, I don't really see a way to logic your way out of that one without
Yeah.
having some type of faith, which is how people have resolved that issue,
Yeah.
historically.
Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Well, I want to go in a new direction now because I am interested in what you're doing right now, especially around the release of the new Dune 2 movie. And okay, so a little bit of background here. I have never read Dune, and until the other day, I had never seen the first film either. But the other day, I was reading this piece and I was like, I really just need to sit down and watch this movie if I'm going to understand some of the things that we're talking about in this conversation. And then I started researching and looking up articles about Dune, and so many things started popping up around the idea of cultural appropriation with regards to the film that came out in 2021. So that's a little bit of my backstory. I am brand new to this topic, but I did watch the movie the other day on HBO, and I really enjoyed it. So, you're an Islamic Studies professor, and you're interested in Dune, and you are writing about it currently. I remember seeing some articles popping up about it years ago, but my lack of familiarity with the story meant I kind of skipped those. But there are tons of articles, there's long Reddit threads. So, I want you to kick off your thoughts on why Dune matters to you.
So Dune matters to me because I think in many ways because I was so shocked when I when the more recent film and the 2021 film Dune Part One that Denis Villeneuve directed, when that came out, I was like, I realized I had never read the book.
Hmm.
And it's a whole series of books, so it's 1965, Frank Herbert, sort of classic. It's one of the most popular sci-fi novels of all time. He famously, sent it off to 20 different publishers, and the 21st one was, I think, Chilton, who published like auto repair like manuals. And part of the reason
Hmm.
they published it is because they had the capacity to publish something that long. It
Hmm.
was not, it's like hundreds and hundreds of pages long. Anyway, so it matters to me because when I sat down to read it, right? The edition that I borrowed from a guy in the neighborhood, because the library wait list in 2021 was like months long.
Huh.
It opened with this appendix that it began with the appendix. Usually I think of appendices as going at the end, but this one, this edition had this appendix called Terminology of the Imperium at the beginning. And I opened that and I just saw all of these Arabic words. And I thought, what is going on? And so you scan through it. This is an exercise I do with my students sometimes. Is I say, okay, I break them into small groups. I say, Google a bunch of these words and tell me what they mean. And a lot of them are derived from Arabic or Persian, sometimes Turkish, and a few other languages. So as an Islamicist, the sort of Muslimness of Dune is a huge part of the story, right? So you have this desert world called Arrakis. It has this the most valuable substance in the galaxy. Dune is set in sort of Earth's or humanity's far future, so it's like 10,000 years in the future. And this substance is called spice, and navigators use this substance. They basically go on a trip, if you will, in a psychedelic sense to be able to navigate to take their spaceships from point A to point B. So it's not like with Star Trek and Star Wars where there's a fancy computer that calculates that. So in Dune, in the Duneverse, as we say, certain types of technology are either don't exist or are heavily restricted. So That's why spice is important. And you can see instantly, you're like, oh, a desert world. It has this valuable commodity. Cue colonial and other imperialist shenanigans. The indigenous people of Dune, who are known as the Fremen, are oppressed. They know a lot more about spice than the emperor or these ruling houses that you're introduced to. First the Harkonnens and then the Atreides, who are the ones you're supposed to identify with. When you read the book, and if you ever do read the book, and certainly when you see the film, all of the films, like the Fremen clearly are made up to resemble different Muslim groups, right? So whether it's the Bedouin in the Arabian Peninsula, Frank Herbert was very influenced by Lawrence of Arabia for sure.
Hmm.
Sometimes you mentioned the Reddit threads, people will say these polls like, "What's your favorite adaptation of Dune?" And usually someone will say, "Well, my preference is actually Lawrence of Arabia. To me, that's the best adaptation, even though that film was released before Frank Herbert published his book, because it's just the influence is just so clear." And from a cultural appropriation point of view, which is something that is a special interest of mine, because I also research sort of yoga in the West. How do we sort out what it means when you have someone like Frank Herbert, who's a white American, who does all this research, right? Uh, create this incredible universe that people have loved and escaped into, has these themes around the dangers of charismatic religious authority, and not just religious, but charismatic authority, charismatic leaders in general that are very prescient, right?
Hmm.
Where we kind of look at that, we're like, oh, charismatic leaders might lead everyone sort of running off the cliff, so to speak. That's their power. How do we reconcile how this story has resonated with a primarily Western sort of white American audience when it draws so heavily on non-Western, non-American, to use this term, if you will, non-white, although we can problematize that, cultures. And it's really something that I don't have like a clear answer on. I'm definitely not out, and I don't think there are any efforts to like try and cancel Dune. Number one, it wouldn't work. It's made too much money.
Mm.
It's never going away. But even and you said you watched Dune Part One, but you haven't
Yeah,
seen Part Two. Is that
not
correct?
yet. I haven't seen part two yet, but I'm
Okay.
curious to. Yeah.
Yeah. So in part one, I'll try and keep my discussion. I won't try and I'll try not to spoil anything for part two.
That's okay.
Um
For
so you're
listeners
in
out
it.
there, spoiler alert, maybe.
That's right. Um the the key Fremen character that you're introduced to in Dune Part One is played by Javier Bardem, and the character's name is Stilgar. And so the character that Timothy Chalamet plays is Paul Atreides, who is like this teenager. His father's the Duke of House Atreides, played by Oscar Isaacs. They come to Arrakis. The Emperor has decreed they will control this planet. Paul Atreides' father, his goal is to rule it in a more benevolent way.
Hmm.
So he sends these people out to make contact with the Fremen. And anyway, it's what ends up happening is that Paul has these visions. He realizes, or he thinks he's different. He's not like the other kids. He's been trained in the sort of these warrior ways his whole life. And then he begins to learn about life on Arrakis. And the Fremen are like, oh, this kid seems like maybe he's this Messiah figure, and they use this term Mahdi, and Mahdi is an Arabic word. This is what's translated usually as Messiah. It's the guided one, and so Frank Herbert uses that term throughout. That's what's used to refer to Paul Atreides. They also use the term lisan el ghaib, and which means sort of speaker of the outer world, if you will, because Paul is not from Arrakis.
Right.
So lisan al-ghaib is also an Arabic phrase that
Mm.
means lisan means tongue or here speaker. And then El being like realm of the unseen, or here you can see how it would be like the outer world. So it's
Hmm.
like right there in the beginning of the film, the audience is getting peppered with all of these Arabic phrases that are drawn from Muslim theological traditions. But we're not given that background. So like there's in the year 2000 there was an adaptation for the Sci-Fi Channel of Dune, like a mini series. And about a month ago, I watched it with one of my friends here in Colorado. And so we were just watching it, and I said, "There's an Arabic phrase. There's an Arabic phrase. There's an Arabic phrase." And my friend was like, "Oh, I had no idea. I thought Herbert was doing something like what Tolkien did, which was he created all these languages."
Right.
So Herbert doesn't create languages so much as he takes phrases from especially Arabic and then he adjusts the meaning. And part of that gap then between how we would use that Arabic phrase today and how Herbert uses it, part of that is that as far as I know, he didn't really study Arabic. I would love to be proven wrong on that because if he did, then that would open up so many realms of analysis. He just did all this research. And, one of my friends said, you're making too big of a deal of this, Patrick. Like it's humanity's far future. Language changes in 9 or 10,000 years. So a phrase, how we use it today, of course, is going to be used slightly different, in 10,000 years. And I'm like, okay, I can like in my head canon, I can sort of reconcile that. But in the here and now, it just feels weird the way that Frank Herbert went about constructing the Fremen and their culture and the way that they're depicted. They're depicted in many respects as these highly superstitious, which then cues irrationality, which then means that they're not as you know, intellectually mm, versed as the Paul and his mother are seen as they're the smart ones, right? A deeper part that they talk about in Dune Part One of this whole development of these legends around this Messiah-like figure coming is that Paul's mother is part of this sort of order of, as we call in the fandom, the space nuns, the Bene Gesserit, and that they have actively cultivated these legends on Arrakis and elsewhere in preparation for what they think will happen, which is this prophecy will come true. So it's like a chicken or the egg scenario,
Yeah.
except except not, right? Because the Bene Gesserit have literally sent people to Arrakis kind of like missionaries, but more like mythological missionaries. They're like, we're going to plant these origin stories. People will believe in these stories. And then when this kid shows up, everyone's like, "Oh, he's the one."
Hmm.
Even though Paul himself is like, "Well, I'm not the one. I'm just a kid that has weird dreams."
Yeah.
There's this dispute around it, right? And so it just brings up so many questions for me because now we've seen three different adaptations for the small or big screen. We had the David Lynch version in 84, we had the sci-fi version in the year 2000, and now the Villeneuve movies 2021, currently 2024, all signs point to Dune Messiah, which is the second book in the series. Dune Part 1 covers half, roughly, of the first novel. Dune Part 2 takes us the rest of the way to the end of the first novel in terms of the material. And then a third film would cover the second novel. Um,
Yeah. Well, I'm curious too. Herbert writing this in the early 60s or maybe in the 50s. I'm not exactly sure when he was working on this specifically, but it was a totally different era as far as like human connectedness than now in the 2020s, where like people all over the world are connected at all moments of every single day. So it's just a totally different context as well. And I know that, you sent me a piece that you're writing about this where you talk about some of the phrasings being like surprising and confusing and a little weird. And you just did give some really good examples of that. So the movie clearly has some appropriation issues, but you argue a little bit that and you seem to like really enjoy it as well. And I really enjoyed the movie too. So I was wondering if you have any thoughts on like the issues that are present and how we like reconcile. and just like accept that or process it, etc. Does that make sense?
It does. The best example of this actually would require me doing a spoiler, a slight spoiler on Dune Part Two. Is that allowed?
It is, yeah.
Okay. And just to go back to your earlier question, Herbert was what I've learned is he researched and was writing this sort of in the 50s and then early 60s, and then it's published in 65. And he probably, given that he went through 20 different publishers before it was accepted, he probably had a finished manuscript, years before 65.
Yeah.
Um, but so in the second film, Paul and his mother Jessica, played by Rebecca Ferguson, they sort of they escape this attack, right, which you saw in Dune Part One, where most of House Atreides are wiped out, and then they gain sanctuary with the Fremen, with this group led by Stilgar, Javier Bardem's character. And one of the things that I noticed is that the way they portray Stilgar in Dune Part Two is he is portrayed as this sort of zealous, kind of fanatical believer that Paul Atreides is the Mahdi, right? That he is this Messiah figure. And they play it. It's a very serious film. Like, I'll just say there's multiple scenes where there's a pile of corpses that are being burned, so it's a heavy, heavy film. Dune Part Two is the only identifiable, for me at least, scenes where they play things for comic relief is basically when Stilgar is sort of claiming to everyone, like Paul does something, and Stilgar's like the Sanalai, right? Like he's this voice of the outer world, or like Paul will do something, and then Stilgar says, as it is written. Paul says, I'm not the Mahdi. And then Stilgar goes to his, sort of group of friends, um, and says, see how humble the Mahdi is. He he knows they won't accept him yet, so he tells them he's not the Mahdi. And everyone in the theater is laughing, and everyone on screen is they're sort of like grinning. They're like, "Oh yes, we have our Messiah." And one of the things that really bothered me about this, and it didn't come clear for me how much it bothered me until I saw that this was becoming a somewhat viral meme, where people were, it's like a picture of Javier Bardem sort of looking, staring intently. And if you watch the film, he's staring at Paul, but he has this sort of look of awe on his face. And the meme will be something like, I ask Paul how he's gonna convert a file to PDF, and then he
Mm.
does it with ease. And I say, oh, le you know? Right. So then it becomes this sort of joke of, this person is the chosen one because they can do something that for me, for my like limited intellectual point of view, is deemed magical. And the fact that the only character who is played for comic relief in this way is the one who, to my mind, visually is made to look like the most Arab, the most Muslim, plays into this Orientalist stereotype that is so damaging that we've seen with disastrous consequences, really the world over, where brown people are depicted as irrational, as superstitious, and because they're irrational and superstitious, then they need to be taught different languages and they need to be taught a different religion. And oh, by the way, we'd like you to embrace capitalism. And oh, by the way, we'd like all of your valuable resources that we can ship off so we can get super rich for centuries.
Mm.
And I do
That's a
acknowledge that
that's a great
I'm,
example too.
yeah, that I'm connecting a lot of dots that other people might say that I'm kind of reaching. But for me, I think given the way that I grew up, where I grew up, what I've studied, there were a lot of threads that were coming together when I was sitting there in the theater just a few weeks ago, watching these specific scenes from Dune Part Two, and then seeing this meme sort of circulate. And I pitched this piece, a different one than what I sent you beforehand, but the one that focused on the Stilgar meme. I pitched that to an online magazine, and they got back to me and said that they weren't convinced that in the film, like the audience in our real world maybe is laughing at Stilgar, but they said they're not convinced. This editor said that they're not convinced that in the film people are laughing at Stilgar, right?
Mm.
So there's a little bit of there's a shift there, different layers of reception. And I think my only counter argument to that is that Stilgar is looked at by other Fremen as an example of, and they use the word fundamentalist,
Mm.
right? He is looked at as we're introduced to this idea in the films of divisions within the Fremen, and the Northern Fremen see themselves as, they want a leader who is one of them. And then the Southern Fremen are depicted as these religious zealots, and in the film they use the term fundamentalist multiple times. That these folks really want this prophecy to come true, and so then Stilgar is a Southerner, and even that, like that dichotomy of the Southerners as being irrational, the Southerners as being less intellectual. I thought, oh wow, I mean, having grown up in Virginia and then living in North Carolina, and then talking to friends and family and colleagues and so forth who live in other parts of the country, we still have that attitude here in the United States, where people look at the South and think of it as, intellectually, culturally backward. Um, which is a legacy of the Civil War primarily.
Interesting. Okay, cool. That's a really great example too. And I think it's important to offer those ideas as well because it helps us rethink certain things that would just gloss over our heads. And it's always important, in my view, to see other angles of ways that media presents information and entertainment to us because those things continue to seep into our subconscious and influence the way that we see the world and also kind of create this like uncritical um, reality where we just kind of like have like the lowest common denominator acceptance of the way the media hits us and we don't often stop to consider how it's impacting our thinking about the greater world long term. So I always love seeing stuff like that and I'm disappointed that the editor didn't allow you to run with that idea. So I'm glad that we could talk about it here so you could get that idea out there a little bit. So I want to talk about one more thing. You are here to because you're a part of a sacred rights cohort, which has I've been working with sacred rights for a long time, and I want to know a little bit about your goals within public scholarship because I know that you're interested in podcasting. I know that you're interested in publishing for like wider audiences. What do you have going on in this world of public scholarship?
Well, the Sacred Rights program has been wonderful. I would encourage anyone who's listening, who's in academia and is tired of presenting conference papers to, a half dozen people, um, and would like to have their ideas out there for a wider audience to really look at sacred rights. Um, I think for me, I've grown tired of the sort of academic I wouldn't call it an echo chamber, but just it feels like I'm only talking, like when I write scholarly stuff, it feels like I'm only talking to, very few people. And I think there's great power in having, a broader reach, So like if we back up and think about these ideas about, say, like colonialism and indigenous rights that we see discussed at least in like even in a film like Black Panther, right? Either of the Black Panther films. There's a lot in there about anti-colonialism and the evils of colonialism, and how many millions of people watch those films
Hmm.
compared to, even if we took one of my, for me, most influential anti-colonial thinkers, Frantz Fanon, um, right? How many people have read his work compared to how many people have seen those films? Right? There's no comparison. And and so for me, not that I'm trying to try to position myself to have the reach of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I have way more humble goals. But I would like to just engage more in the public discourse because when I see these films that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to produce, and I see little places where the director, the writers, the producers are making choices that um, resubstantiate or reinscribe these what I think are really harmful ideas. I think you could tell the story differently. You could tell the story differently, and in so doing, the stories we tell create our world. And that leads then to the idea of the podcast, which I'm going to title Worlds Within Worlds, where I want to talk about religion and science fiction and fantasy. I want to interview authors, especially of books. I mean, I'm open to talking to people who are in the film world too, but especially authors of books because we have so much incredible fantasy and science fiction that's being authored um, by people from all over the world. We're getting out of that sort of where every fantasy book has to be kind of like in the Game of Thrones universe, which is basically sort of like, Western European legends and myth as the base.
Hmm.
And so that's what I'm excited to do is just to contribute to the content that's out there, that's sort of examining and interpreting and in where relevant or where appropriate, celebrating the growth in the sort of sci-fi and fantasy field. And I feel like that even this category of religion, we talk about this a lot in religious studies, that it's sort of a function of our definitions of religion are heavily influenced by sort of post-Reformation Protestant Christianity. And to highlight when we talk about, say, if take a fantasy story that's set in Mesoamerica, like Rebecca Roanhorse's Black Sun trilogy, or like Tasha Suri, who writes about sort of it's like high fantasy, but it's set in sort of a medieval like India or Indian setting context. So there's different attitudes about gods and goddesses. There's different, I mean, in Rebecca Roanhorse's work, instead of dragons, we have these huge crows, which are incredible. So I would recommend her books just for that, if you're into fantastical beasts. Um, and so that's kind of where I see my trajectory is, I still enjoy the scholarly writing. I have a book coming out next month, actually,
Mm.
co-authored with Carl Ernst, who was my PhD advisor. It's called Breathtaking Revelations. I can send you a link, but it's looking at these esoteric breathing practices that were translated from Sanskrit and Hindi into Persian during the medieval period in India, and then circulated quite widely within the what we call the Persianate sphere. Um, so in South Asia, what we would today call Iran and parts of Central Asia. Um, and so that side of things is it's very important to me. It brings up all these questions about categories, and the power dynamics in terms of who gets to define a category, who gets to set those boundaries. And I think that takes me back to these core questions of the intersection of religion and science fiction. A big part of these discourses is who gets to be defined as fully human
Hmm.
and what types of rights and responsibilities and privileges do those fully human individuals get versus those who are defined as not quite human or subhuman. So I just see so many overlaps when I think about these various discourses.
Well, I am delighted that you're thinking of dipping your toes into this world, because the rewarding nature of being able to release timely podcast interviews on any topic that you could possibly want to talk about is so intrinsically rewarding, and the results are so immediate that I personally can't recommend it enough, because this has been a sustaining creative force for me now, for 7 years. So I think that this is like, if if you pace yourself and you do exactly what you want to do, the reward is huge. So I look forward to hearing more about your podcasting endeavor. And uh, maybe you and your co-author of the book could come on and do a joint episode of the podcast, um, in the very near future. So congratulations on the imminent release of that book project as well. That's very fun. And I would just like to conclude by thanking you for being here and, joining me for this wonderful conversation. You've helped me process my new Dune interest. as well as my interest in sci-fi. We didn't really get a whole chance to talk about it, but I'm a huge like Kim Stanley Robinson fan, and I'm really into his like New York 2140 and his Ministry for the Future books and things like that. So I love pushing my own understanding within the world of science fiction writing. And I'm just curious where people can find you if they want to follow along with what it is that you've got going on. Where can people find more?
Absolutely. So the easiest place to find me is my website is patrickjdesilva.com, and there's no punctuation in De Silva for the URL. We could have a whole different podcast episode talking about the uh, how punctuation in names enforces certain types of of social orders.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had one school, all the schools I've gone to, all the places I've worked, I've had one place that gave me an apostrophe in my email address, and everyone always commented on it like, I didn't know it was possible. And I was like, it's an apostrophe. It's not gonna destroy the world, you know. It's
Mm.
it's not like Thanos and the Snap in the MCU. It's not that dangerous. So yeah, so just my name, Patrick, and then middle initial J, and then DSILVA .com, and that's where I post sort of updates on what I'm up to, and I'll definitely be posting there as I get the Worlds Within Worlds podcast up and running. And Greg, it would be awesome to come back. We can reach out to Carl, see if we can set something up. And thank you so much for the invitation to be with you for this time. I've had a great time.
Dr. Patrick De Silva, thanks so much for being here.